Thanks very much. We'll open the floor to questions if anyone would like to ask Professor Krugman a question. Anyone want to get the ball rolling? Got
back there?
Yeah, someone back there.
Read your blogs quite a bit, and just recently I've noticed that I think you started off being a mild skeptic, I think, about the euro. I'm not an opponent to it, but a mild skeptic. And seemed to harden over time. And just most recently, I think you seem to be thinking that it just might be able to pull through, or it might be able to work.
Yeah.
Is that a fair representation of your?
Yeah. So let me give you my stages of Euroscepticism. So I still think that if the appropriate policy is actually, I have young relatives who are Doctor Who fans. So to steal the TARDIS, go back to Maastricht in 1992 and burst into the room and say, don't do this, right? I think it was a mistake, and in fact, it's more of a mistake than the skeptics realized. Because when we were talking about the skeptical case against the euro back in the early 90s, when the ugly Anglo-Saxons were making the case against it, was that it would be very difficult to adjust. Suppose that you had a localized boom that then turns into a slump. You really need to get your wages down relative to other countries. You can't devalue because you no longer have a currency, so you're going to have a very painful adjustment. That we knew was coming. What very few people thought about was that you could also have banking crises that you had no good answer to because you no longer had a central bank that was your own individual lender of last resort, and that you could have fiscal crises that would be both a problem of having a single currency without a single government, and also even at the level of governments not having a central bank as lender of last resort. So the fiscal side had been in there in the discussion, but was not emphasized sufficiently. We didn't realize how bad that was, and the banking side was completely out of it. So it turns out that there are two additional big problems with the single currency that nobody saw coming. That's a reason why it should never have happened. It's not necessarily a reason to break it up, because it's reversing, once you're in the disruption, the craziness of, and both the economic and I'd say even more so perhaps the political costs of having this European project just broken up are very severe. So it's very different. There's still a question whether somebody, I really don't understand why Cyprus stays in, but it's very, the costs are large. Now in terms of hanging together, the way I put it is this: the really acute, what we had in 2011, 2012 were these doom loops, where people would lose confidence in Italian bonds, bond prices would drop, Italian banks which were holding Italian bonds would then be in financial trouble, which would make them even less able to buy Italian bonds. Interest costs for the Italian government would rise, making its fiscal outlook worse. And look, we had two very near brushes with complete collapse of the Eurozone. That has abated, and the reason it's abated is two words, which is Mario Draghi. The current president of the ECB is both a very smart economist, went to school with me, of course, like everybody. It's actually true. Everybody you've heard of was at MIT in the mid-'70s. But anyway, and also it turns out a brilliantly skillful political operator, able to figure out exactly how far he can push it, able to maneuver past the hawks on his own board. So he has actually the ECB has been there with cash. It has been there to short circuit the doom loops. So that means that abrupt meltdown has been taken off the table, which is a very good thing. And economies tend to get better. Leave them, as long as nothing really terrible is happening, eventually they tend to get better. And the politics of economic policy is that people mostly don't react to the absolute state of affairs. They react to whether it's getting better or worse. We know this actually quantitatively for the US, where it's overwhelming that presidential elections don't depend on the unemployment rate. They depend on whether the economy has been growing in the 3 quarters before the election. And so even if you have a terrible economy, as long as the economy is growing, the incumbent tends to be reelected, as Mitt Romney found out to his horror last year. The year before last. God, time is going by. Anyway, so, sorry, this is a long answer to a short question, but so the point is now, the euro, the hot crises are over. Slowly, stuff tends to get a little bit better. Ireland was probably never going to break it anyway, but you can see it in the others as well. What you find for all of the debtor countries, they have go like that, terrible plunge, and then they're sort of creeping up, but they are creeping up. And that creep is probably enough to allow the existing political order to hang on. It's also been news. I mean, I have to say European policy elites have been both more determined to stay with this thing and more able to hold on despite dissension than I would have expected. Which is by and large, even though I don't like it, the policies, is a good thing. Right? I'd rather have Greece very painfully surviving to the point where it's where Greek wages have fallen so much that they start to attract lots of holiday tourists, which is basically the way their way out, then have Golden Dawn become the government of Greece. So the story I'm telling right now is that the economic, what could have been a complete nightmare scenario, has been controlled by intelligent leadership at the ECB, and the political side. The European political order has proved to be more durable than many of us thought, and even a slow improvement from a very bad place is probably enough to let it hang together. So it hurts to see people then claiming this is vindication. This is a huge economic and social losses along the way, but probably not a breakup. Pick some.
And in Ireland it's oftentimes mentioned by politicians on the left that we need to stimulate the economy. However, politicians on the right often say that we can't stimulate the economy because Ireland is an open economy. However, whenever we do tend to talk about stimulating the economy, then very rarely is it actually mentioned the ways in which we do that. So I'm just wondering, what areas of the economy do you think Ireland can stimulate in order to increase economic growth?
So Ireland, we're not talking about stimulus, except in the sense we're talking about less anti-stimulus, right? We're talking about less austerity. And I actually haven't looked hard at it, but I think Ireland's had large cutbacks in public services and public investment. So, I mean, I know that's in the case of the UK, which I know a little bit better. If you ask what has the coalition there done, they've done very sharp cuts in public investment. And so what those of us who hope in vain that they'll see reason want is not actually so much to have a positive stimulus program as simply to reverse the cuts in public investment that they've undertaken. I think that's all we're talking about in this case. I mean, Ireland, the open economy thing is actually not as nearly as big an issue as people imagine. You say, oh yes, Ireland's very open to trade, but even every advanced economy that's bigger than a city-state is still going to have 70 or 75% of its employment in non-tradable sectors. So the idea that stimulus will just leak abroad is wrong. What Ireland does have is it has the problem of not having its own currency, and the problem of having an overhang of debt that it kind of needs, as long as it's on the euro, it needs the help of the ECB and to a lesser extent the Troika as a whole to finance. So, it's very difficult for an Irish government to just say no to Troika demands. There are a lot of jobs I really am glad not to have, and being a prime minister in a European debtor country is one that I'm really glad not to have, because even if you know that it's all wrong, there's very little room. You have very little room to do anything different. Yeah, sorry, I should let you do the calling.
Just on what you were talking about in your speech about where policymakers often have these adverse incentives to go against what might be necessarily economically sensible. I know what you're talking about there about the adoption of the single currency in the first place, despite the fact that it was just, there was some serious time that it could go wrong.
Right.
A lot of people, when they're looking back on that, say the reason that currency plan was adopted was more so as a political project for Europe because of the history of the EU as a peace-building institution. Do you think that's an attitude that still exists for policymakers, and do you think that could have more ramifications in terms of getting out of this crisis and in the future?
Well, it certainly is it's at least in some places, it's a very big thing. So yes, the single currency was clearly, it was a symbol. And it was taken as it was based actually on the bicycle theory of Europe. Bicycle has to keep moving forward or it falls down. The view was, well, we have to keep on moving along with new steps towards European integration. We've done, we created the customs union, then we had the Single European Act, what's next? And the next was supposed to be the single currency. And people who believed in that view were not at all receptive to the notion, to those of us who were saying, this is not like the previous ones. The economics of this one are not sound. If you look at the countries that have actually moved to adopt the euro, despite everything that's going wrong, Baltics, very much the political side is very much there. If you want to ask why did Estonia join the euro, why is Latvia moving that way? Yes, they've managed to convince themselves that their austerity programs worked, even though their numbers are not actually that much better than Ireland's. But also, they're looking over their shoulder at Vladimir Putin. They're saying we need to be unmistakably, inseparably part of Europe because we do not have a happy history with our neighbor in the other direction. And so that's, you have to understand that. What's interesting are the countries, I think that dream of European Union had a lot to do with the adoption, and the continuing concern about maintaining Europe has a lot to do with the determination in defending the euro despite everything. What's interesting is that there are countries that have managed to be pretty good Europeans while staying out of it. Very interesting. Sweden is an interesting case because there the political establishment was overwhelmingly not only for the euro but insisting that catastrophe would follow if they didn't join. But they did hold the referendum, which I remember very well because my friends called me at 3 a.m. to celebrate. And doesn't hurt. It's actually been clearly a major benefit to them to be out. So yeah, it's still there, and these are interesting. This was an experiment. The United States. How do I say this? The European idea was to use monetary union to push political union. And because they knew that political union wasn't going to happen anytime soon, so the idea was we're going to create a feeling of unity with the single currency, which has turned out to be a very questionable thing because the blowback has now been huge. I always think, as an American, I always think it's quite funny to look at the notes. The euro notes, which have pictures of doors and bridges on them. Not, every place else you have pictures of dead politicians, right? And but in Europe you have pictures of doors and bridges, and then the question is which doors, which bridge are we looking at here? The answer, you know this, right? That it's no bridge in particular, because that would be favoring one country over another. So they have to be generic Europeanoid bridges, and they actually had to scrap a set of plates because it was recognizably the Pont Neuf in Paris. So anyway, so that's saying, hey, from my side of the Atlantic, we say that means you were not ready for a single currency, but all right, they wanted it.
Yeah. So every so often the US approaches this fiscal cliff when there's lots of drama and news, and then eventually you get sorted. Do you think that there are enough anti-economics people in Congress that one day, coming soon, they might actually just drive straight over, or will there always be enough people to be able to stop?
Wow. So we have, doesn't that mean that there, could go on and on about U.S. politics, but you have a funny situation with the Republican Party right now. It is still, at some level, or in parts, it's the party of big business. And those interests clearly don't want a U.S. government default. The fiscal cliff, too much. But anyway, and we have this bizarre thing, right, where Congress votes first. They vote spending bills and tax bills, and then they have a separate vote on whether to allow the government to borrow to make up the difference between the revenue and the spending. And it's kind of, you can vote, require, by rule of law, require the president to do certain things, and then pass another law which says he can't actually do them. And it's bizarre. And there, actually, if we ever do get to this point, there are a number of indications now that if they do actually refuse to raise the debt ceiling on the next round, which is quite possible, not likely, but it's possible in March, that Obama will sidestep them. He has several routes, one of which is to simply declare, I'm being told to do two different things, and my constitutional duty is therefore to continue funding the government normally, or the platinum coin. Do people know about that? There's a weird loophole there's a law that says that the Treasury Department can issue platinum coins in such denomination as it sees fit. It was meant to be able to coin them as medallions or to commemorate occasions, but it doesn't say that. So there is really no reason why, legally, they can in fact print stamp a coin and say that it's worth $1 trillion. It doesn't have to have $1 trillion worth of platinum in it. So everybody thought that was silly, but we now know, it has somehow come out that during the last debt ceiling crisis, the White House was exploring the legal options for doing just that. So but what's happened is that if we ask about the primary voters in the Republican Party, so the people who actually select the candidates, they are pretty wild. Many of them just don't believe that there would be any problem. If the U.S. government can't honor its bills, fine. I mean, we don't want that government anyway. And they mean that essentially every Republican member of Congress is either an extremist or pretending to be an extremist, because he has to do that in order to get nominated. So the risk is very much there. But I think at this point, two things. One is they clearly took a hit in the polls, a very severe hit during the last confrontation. And the other is that Obama is prepared to sidestep them. So I think we're not going to see that happen in the near future. Afterwards, we could have, there are some very strange people who have a serious chance of becoming the Republican nominee for president. And given what we know about the determinants of elections, if we should just happen to have a recession coinciding with that election, just about anybody, once nominated, could become president. So, President, well, you probably don't know these people, but President Ted Cruz, President Rand Paul, those are actual possibilities. They're in single-digit probabilities, but not fraction of a percent possibilities. Try someone from the other side.
Okay, question. 20 years ago, you were making some of the same observations about Japan. Japan basically did nothing for the 20 years.
Yeah.
What are the chances that Europe could be the next Japan?
Oh, wow. I would say you want to reverse that, right? What are the chances that Europe will not have a Japan scenario? I mean, everything is set up for that. In fact, by the way, the United States is not doing we're doing a little better, but not that well either. So, when I first of all, look, if we're asking about lost decade, right? We're already 6 years in, so lost decade is pretty easy to achieve at this point. Of course, the Japanese sort of had almost 2 lost decades, although they were doing okay on the eve of the crisis. In terms of the policy response, so those of us who were studying Japan, actually, when I arrived, I was hired at Princeton in 2000. And I think it was partly to sort of augment. We had a little group, all broken up now, of Japan warriors at Princeton. All of us economists who had taken a look at Japan and said, there's a lot of superficial differences, but at a fundamental level, this looks a lot like us. This is an advanced country, politicians who are, or certainly or economic officials who are maybe not optimal but are not idiots. If they can get caught in this kind of trap, it could happen to other advanced countries as well. So viewing Japan as kind of an omen. And there was a group of 4 senior faculty and then a number of junior faculty as well. And so it was me, it was Mike Woodford, so if the economists will know who he is, very much an inside economist guy, but very influential. Lars Svensson, who recently left as the deputy governor of the Riksbank because his colleagues wouldn't listen to him, and what was his name? Bernanke, Ben Bernanke. Don't know what happened to him. And we were all very harshly critical of the Japanese for their failure to respond effectively to a depressed economy. I've been suggesting that we should all go to Tokyo and apologize to the emperor, because in fact the policy response both in the United States and in Europe has been worse than that of the Japanese, and the amount of human suffering has been far greater than Japan has ever experienced. So I mean, I compare, if you follow the track of the policy response to burst bubbles and the economic performance, Japan at this point doesn't look like a cautionary tale, it looks like a role model. If only we were doing as well as the Japanese have done, we would be in a lot better shape.
Okay, yes, according to our latest report from IMF, the Chinese economy in terms of total GDP already surpassed the United States in 2013.
Yeah.
Okay, in terms of purchase power parity. So, in your personal view, in the next 20 years or even 10 years, so Chinese economy will be sustainable, or some big crisis in front of us?
Okay, so the first thing about, I have to say these PPP calculations of the economy, and they're important, you want to know them, but at some level they don't actually matter for anything, right? The market value of Japan, boy, I'm sliding, I'm retrogressing into the 30 years ago now myself, back to the days when Japan was a fast-growing economy. The market value of Chinese output is a definite thing, and that determines how much weight China has in the world economy. The rate of growth of China is a real thing, or we know it's high, so it's a very fast-growing economy. It's hard to think of anything concrete that depends upon whether you use an estimate of purchasing power GDP that says it's 70% of the US, or you use an estimate that says it's 100%. Really doesn't change anything about the situation. But China is certainly, it's an awesome story, and because it's such a, because it's so large, it doesn't have to achieve anything like Western productivity to become one of the biggest, if not the biggest economies in the world. Things we know. We're reasonable, it's definite that Chinese growth will slow, because an important part of the growth has been shifting workers from a very low productivity traditional agricultural sector into a higher productivity modern urban manufacturing sector. So, and you run out of peasants. In fact, that's already happening. Chinese wages have started to rise quite strongly because they're running into the limits of their surplus labor. So that's going to mean slowing growth for sure. The question is whether it's a smooth transition to a slower growth rate, or whether there's a big problem along the way. And here's where you get worried, because China has this very, very unbalanced economy with investment of close to 50% of GDP, very little consumption. That's sustainable as long as the economy is growing very fast, because you can justify the investment by the fact that there's going to be more demand, and in some sense you're actually building factories to supply the equipment to build more factories. That's caricature, but it's roughly true. But if the growth has to slow at a certain point, then no way you can justify that investment. The return on investment drops sharply, and you really need to shift towards much higher consumption. You need to rebalance the economy, and we're talking about something like 20% of GDP that has to somehow move. And what happens if that doesn't occur smoothly? And if you look at the last couple of years, China's growth was starting to stutter, and they pushed it up, but they pushed it up through a lot of credit to corporations, to state-owned enterprises, and so all of a sudden there's this explosion of essentially of business debt, or quasi-business, because a lot of it is state-owned. And what that looks like, there's a reason why I was thinking Japan. It looks to me like Japan in the late 80s, which had a bubble, and a real estate bubble, which at least looks like it's happening in China, but also a huge bubble in corporate debt. And then the bubble burst, and Japan became the troubled economy. So if somebody asks me, where could I see an economic crisis occur in the next year, 18 months? I actually can't see it in Europe, because I think Mario has got is standing ready to hand out the euro notes. I don't see it happening in the United States. China is certainly a real prospect, and then of course there's, for looking further ahead, to get through that, then there's the question of running out of air and water, which is, if you've looked at some of those photos from Beijing and Shanghai in recent months, you know that's a problem too. The environmental constraints on growth become serious. But no, China, it's a hugely impressive thing. But and they don't have to be, they don't have to surpass the West in anything to become the world's leading economy. But they have a lot of big problems in the next few years.
Since the recession, what are the chances, do you think, of the West taking back some of its manufacturing base that it...
Yeah, I haven't done the European... in the United States, I think it's actually quite good that manufacturing makes a comeback. But it doesn't... Manufacturing makes a comeback, but the manufacturing workforce probably doesn't. Right? So if we look, there's a couple of things that are working in favor of U.S. manufacturing. One of them is energy. They like it or not, we have a lot of fracking. Gas has become cheap, and that has a lot to do. That's an advantage. There's a definite sense among manufacturing companies that they overreached on globalization. That all of this vertical disintegration of the production chain, with stuff going back and forth across the Pacific to save a few % on labor costs, was overlooking the logistics advantages of having production closer to the market. And so there's definitely reshoring going on. Lots of anecdotes on that, some data. It's kind of interesting, actually. We look at there's been a lot of people claiming that we have shortages, that our workforce doesn't have the skills it needs. And the counter to that has always been, you say that, well, show me some class of skilled workers who are actually getting wage increases. Show me some sign that there's actually a skill that's sufficiently in demand that they're willing to pay for it. And it turns out there is one, at least one reasonably large class. It turns out that the United States is now suffering from a shortage and sharply rising wages for people who know how to operate sewing machines. Because there's a significant reshoring of the apparel industry taking place, and it's suddenly turning out that nobody in the United States knows how to sew clothing together. So that's an indication of this stuff. Trouble is that most of the manufacturing is at this point just not employing a lot of people. Manufacturing, the United States has a huge, dominant in many ways, agricultural sector. But we actually, this is one of my favorite comparisons, we actually have fewer farmers in the United States than we have people playing World of Warcraft. And so and manufacturing is going that way. It's just going to be so highly productive that we'll have manufacturing, but there just won't be a lot of people engaged in manufacturing.
I know you've been a champion of quantitative easing for a long time. I was just wondering whether you've seen a lot of effects from it in the US.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Funny, I'm getting punchy here. I saw Mervyn King, who's in New York at the moment, enjoying his retirement, and he and his wife had actually come over by ocean liner. Never happens. People do it, but so he came over on the Queen Mary, and I was very proud of myself because I immediately said, I should have been on the QE too. But anyway, that's a very inside economics joke. I've been So quantitative easing, I guess probably people know, right? Normally the Fed or any central bank but the Fed makes policy by buying short-term U.S. Treasuries and driving down interest rates. And the trouble is short-term interest rates are zero, so they can't do any more of that. So instead they've been buying longer-term assets, which don't have zero interest rates. That's quantitative easing. Very misleading name, actually. It's actually qualitative rather than quantitative. But anyway, and I've been for it basically because it's hard to see what else to do. That I'd really be for fiscal stimulus, and I'd also be for trying to manage expectations, forward guidance, trying to keep interest rates low by saying you're going to keep the interest rates you control low for a really long time. The evidence on the quantitative easing is not overwhelming. What you'd really be looking for is some evidence that interest rates on long-term assets have been lower than you would expect given what you know or about expected interest rates at the short term. And there is basically very, very little evidence that buying of long-term treasuries has done anything. The Fed itself has more or less accepted that didn't do any harm, but it's not clear it did any good. There's more evidence that that they've managed to, by buying somewhat riskier assets, by buying mortgage-backed securities, although they've only bought the ones that are issued by U.S. Government-sponsored enterprises, that they've managed to squeeze down those interest rates a little bit. And so there's some positive stuff. And there's a fair bit of evidence that they've managed to affect expectations by that, not so much that the quantitative easing itself does anything as that it ends up being a helpful signal that they're also going to keep short-term rates low. But I'm okay with, so the Fed is scaling back, tapering the QE. Mostly they're just doing the government bond stuff, which we don't think was having much effect. But they're coupling that with lots of forward guidance, telling people, look, we really, really want to keep rates low for a long time. They seem to be pulling it off, and that's okay. You might say, why not just keep on doing it if it doesn't do any harm? And there I think the answer is political, that they have got all of these crazy people in Congress screaming that they're going to start a hyperinflation any day. And so expanding their balance sheet is not without cost on the political side. And so I think what they're doing is okay. But they're going to have to really work at communicating that their policy is going to stay very loose. And in an ideal world, I'd want them to raise their inflation target. I'd want everybody to be raising their inflation targets. I'd actually want them to be doing what Abe's doing in Japan, except they're starting from minus and going to 2. I would like us to go from 2 to 3 or 4. But not in the next couple of years, anyway.
Take one or two final. How do you think we can better solve the problem of interdependence between banks?
Okay. I mean, I'd put it this way: that I mean that could mean different things. I'm not sure which kind of interdependence. I mean, there's the general issue of a failed bank starting a run, and which is the reason that you end up with bailouts, and then you start to worry about moral hazard effects of bailouts. And the answer to that is regulation. The answer to that is higher capital requirements, because you want banks to be further from having a run, and you also want, in effect, to tax people who are you want to limit leverage, because leverage brings on this risk. Then there's a especially European problem, which is, well, you know, if a bunch of German Landesbanken lend lots and lots of money to Irish banks that then, or Spanish cajas, let's do them. So take it. You know, if German regional banks lend lots of money to Spanish regional savings and loans, which then make a lot of bum loans, and the result is that the Spanish banks have to be bailed out for the stability of the European system. Who pays for that? And as it's worked out, of course, the answer is Spain. And somehow, and then they get lectures from the Germans on the evils of irresponsibility. So you really want to change. You really want to have a banking union. You really want to think about. Actually, there's a quite good parallel there where the U.S. once upon a time had its own, CAHAs are quite a lot like U.S. thrifts, savings and loans, and we had our own case of runaway thrifts making really bad loans, largely financed with borrowing on the wholesale market from banks elsewhere, other U.S. banks, and they were bailed out, and they were bailed out by the federal government. And the result of that was, it was in effect a $100 billion bailout of the state of Texas in the late 1980s. Which nobody even talked about it that way, and that was back when $100 billion was real money. So Europe really needs banking union. It needs a European Deposit Insurance Corporation that would because it is a European financial system, and the stability issues are Europe-wide, and it really should not be the responsibility of local taxpayers to bail out lenders in other jurisdictions.
You've written on your blog about Germany's lack of reciprocity when back in the boom recovery in the mid-early 2000s, Germany was basically offset by expansion in Spain.
Right.
And if you were cynical, you might look at the inflation rate and say, actually it's the control variable is Germany's inflation rate, not the Eurozone as a whole as the inflation rate. Right. And I guess Germany is very much, they're inflation averse. How do you counter that? You said 3 or 4% there for inflation. How do you get that into the thinking? It seemed to me that it would be populist to say we should be out protesting on the streets for wage rises for German workers, and that would work. How can we get that inflation? Stop worrying about inflation and learn to love it.
Yeah. Well, no. If you've been following Draghi's recent speeches and testimony and all of that, looks to me like he's engaged in a gradual softening up campaign for precisely that. He's been talking, can't put it that way, right? He can't go and say what I want is higher inflation in Germany, but he can talk a lot about, and he has been talking about deflation risks for Europe, how it's very, and all of that has as a logic, well, we actually have to have more aggressively expansionary policies at the ECB, which, well, of course, it'll have as a side consequence rising inflation in Germany, which is actually true, but we won't focus on that. So I think that's where it comes from. I don't think it's the idea that you're going to be able to have an engineered wage rise in Germany is probably. Germany has a very powerful trade union movement, but the thing is, they buy into ordoliberalism every bit as much as everybody else does in Germany. It just the trying to have discussions of macroeconomics in Germany is not an edifying experience. We were actually was at an event in where my wife was, and Schäuble was giving the keynote, and my wife, as we left, said we're all going to be given whips to scourge ourselves as we leave. Their view of it is just it's all about morality, and you just can't have an analytic discussion. But as it turns out, we have a smart, cunning, devious guy at the ECB, so maybe he can do it through the back door.
Great.
I think on that note,
yeah.
Thank you all.
So the only thing that is left to do is to present you with the James Joyce Award in recognition of your outstanding contribution to the economic sciences.
Okay.
So I think everyone will join me in giving you a round of applause.
All right, yeah. There we go. Yeah. Vertical. There we go.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.